Hey, I'm alright, thanks.
In the Cloaky fleet, but I'm also guessing some of them are watching things. I wonder if Pukes is around. Let me see if he'll. Hmm, must not be here.
Yeah, that cloaky fleet's been going all day, though, hasn't it?
Here, maybe they were AFKing it, but there's still a lot of people in the channel above us.
Yeah, the quick fleet that Jake did earlier was pretty cool with Thrashers and Burst Logi.
Yeah, that's fun. He always does good stuff when it comes to the cheap fleets. People like to, bitch about him or whatever, but he does a good job. I hope you've got a lot of questions ready. I can do this presentation without anybody asking questions, but it's a lot more interesting when people bring up, different points and things, so you can sort of have a conversation and talk about, the different aspects of it. But
Yeah, I mean, flying interceptors is. I've flown a few interceptors before. It's more about understanding how to scout properly that is what I'm concerned about.
yeah,
I wish
that
to learn
is,
how to be a good scout.
yeah, that's well, and that's like I said, that's a big portion of actually being a fleet interceptor, and that's another thing that a lot of people don't understand. They think all the interceptors are kind of the same as far as what they're for, and there's a very exact distinction between combat interceptors and fleet interceptors, and they actually make it very obvious in the game now that there's a distinction between the two. But still, a lot of people need it sort of laid out a bit further. Um, and yeah, I actually kind of start the beginning of the presentation off with some of that. It would be nice if while I'm doing this, because I'm going to start the presentation right now, um, if you could just keep picking up X's, free moves on, if you see anybody else that wants to get in, and then just let me know and I'll make sure they end up in.
Hey. Okay. Do you record your own voice and then listen to it while you sleep?
I gotta move this notification feed. The notification feed goes on top of everything now. It's like it's a higher priority than everything.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, for anybody that hasn't been made aware of what this stream is about, we're doing a Fleet Interceptor tutorial presentation, basics of how to fit and fly Fleet Interceptors for the people who are with us. Afterwards, we're going to do maybe some practical application practice. The best way to do that is actually to be a part of a fleet that is made up of more than just interceptors, where you are the dedicated scout slash forward tackle for the group. Um, and you just have to accept to make that happen, because as most people probably know already, interceptors are extremely important for nearly every type of fleet in the game. You fit into um, every composition that exists. You may not be a part of the core fleet, but every fleet requires interceptors, especially with their relatively recent rebalancing and being made bubble immune. They have a lot of advantages to offer for a fleet. So anyways, let's jump right into it. Like I said, this is stuff we're going to be going over. You guys have the presentation link. I suppose I can put the link in the stream so people can follow along that way if they'd like. Well, actually, I'm not sure how to do that. Hold on. Anyway, yeah, this is the stuff we're going to be going over. We're going to talk about some ship fits. We'll talk about some basic overview settings. Overview settings have been made a lot easier since the first time I gave this presentation, which is awesome because you can trade overviews between people who know what they're doing and people who don't, which speeds the process along. We're going to talk about some basic tackling and tactics for getting point on targets. We're going to talk a little bit about some scouting and communication, and then target selection and management, and in that case talking about the types of things to look out for as an interceptor pilot, and as well as positioning yourself during fleet fights. Could you copy and paste the... Well, one sec, I'll just do it this way. Never mind, that's not going to work. Okay. So, like we were mentioning kind of right before we started, there's a distinction between fleet interceptors and combat interceptors in the game. The primary, the most obvious difference being that the fleet interceptors receive a bonus to the range of warp disruption and warp scrambler modules on the ship. So when you're flying in Ares, if you have Interceptor 5, that bonus applies to a Tech 2 warp disruptor and means that rather than you having 24 kilometers of unheated point range, you have 30 kilometers of unheated point range, which is a pretty significant difference because it means that you have 6 kilometers to point people where you are not vulnerable to being held down yourself. On top of that, there's differences obviously in the DPS output. If you've ever attempted to fit a Tyrannus versus fit an Ares, you'll notice that the Tyrannus pushes significantly more damage. It's able to almost double the DPS that the Ares is capable of pushing. But the Ares has an advantage in that it is also a lot faster. Very recently it got a buff to its agility, and so that's been even more exaggerated, not the right word, exaggerated, I guess, by recent changes that have taken place. But in each case, I have them, spaced out across from their combat equivalent. The fleet interceptors are faster. The fleet interceptors do less DPS, and the fleet interceptors share a bonus to warp disruption and warp scrambling range. So I have just some example fits. This is a dedicated fleet fit for an Ares. A lot of people will say, well, you've got 4 low slots, why would you shield tank it? And the answer to that, of course, is you want to be able to use those low slots to give yourself more speed. A lot of people will make the argument that in flying interceptors, you just want to rely on your speed entirely as your tank. You should never be getting hit. If you're getting hit, you're doing it wrong, all that. I disagree with it, and the reason I disagree with it is that in today's game, warriors track very, very well. Warriors are extremely fast. You can, in a lot of cases, outrun them for some time, but when they do catch up to you, having no tank means that they will rip you apart very, very quickly. Now you can see in this fit, I'm running a damage control as well as a medium shield extender. It's not even that tight of a fit. I do have a couple of fitting modules on there, but it has nearly 5,000 effective hit points, and in fact, if you're in a fleet where there's any sort of bonuses being passed around, you'll squeak over 5k, which is pretty hardy for something that's able to go 5,000 meters a second plus before heat. I believe it overheats to 7,200 meters a second. Signature radius of 90. So if you picture, if you were in an afterburner fit stabber, you've got maybe a signature radius of about 110, and that takes fairly minimal damage when going about 1,100 meters a second. So at 5,000 meters a second and even less signature radius, you're very difficult for anything, missiles to catch up to. You're very difficult for anything to track. You've got a lot of advantages. Clearly, the ship is not meant to deal a lot of damage. I have it loaded in this example called Iron Navy Thorium. It's actually not a bad idea to fly with that, because in instances where you have things like drones chasing you around, having the closest range ammo means you have to wait till they actually catch up to you before you start dealing damage. A lot of times when people see their drones start to take damage, they will pull them off of you. So if you can hit further out, it tends to be to your advantage. You can use spike, but you take a tracking penalty when you do that. So even though you're hitting farther out, if the drones do catch up to you, in a lot of cases, then you're no longer able to hit them. Ares has been made into a very, very fun ship to fly as of recently. There's actually a lot of different ways to do all of these, of course. Just like any ship in EVE Online, you can kind of do them however you like. I previously flew a similar fit, but with blasters, because if you ran into something like a Lonely Hauler, you could just tear it apart really quick, even before the fleet showed up. But you have options. So are you guys in the chat channel with me? Are you looking at the fits?
I am.
Any comments about the Ares in particular?
No, that's good.
Yeah, it looks like a good solid fit.
Yeah, I mean, it works. I've flown this exact fit. I'm sitting in the fit in game right now. I've flown a lot of that Ares in particular. It's very effective. The biggest disadvantage with that, and I'll kind of talk about it in the next slide, I think, is that with 3 mid slots and it being a shield tank, there's no room for a scrambler, which unfortunately means that certain things can just MJD away from you. Micro jump drives, the introduction of those have made an interesting change to how you have to tackle certain ships. Well, let's actually skip ahead. Let's go to Stiletto, because then we can sort of talk about the difference there. You can see it's actually fairly similar in the way that it's set up. It prioritizes having a little bit of a buffer in its shields, as well as being as fast as possible. So slightly slower than the Ares in this case, but slightly more effective hit points. Some significant differences, though, is that it has a utility high slot, which has a NOS in it. If you know anything about how NOSes work, they will attempt to drain capacitor away from the enemy ship and give it to you. Now, in the case of an interceptor, that amount of NOS is enough to maintain your scramblers on the target. You may, if you're using it, it means a couple things. It means you're inside of scram range, so you're scramming the enemy target. It's very likely they're scramming you back, so your MWD is probably off. But you still coast relatively quickly. Your ship, probably coasts around 650 to 750 meters per second with no MWD, with no prop mod. So unless you're webbed as well as being scrammed, you actually can orbit fast enough to get under the tracking of a lot of types of guns. So let's, as a hypothetical example, if you've tackled a Vagabond, he's going to have a medium newt on you in all likelihood. That small NOS will be enough to allow you to maintain tackle while he tries desperately to have his drones shoot you off of them. Depends on how they're fit. They don't generally have webs. Sometimes they do, but you've got more of a chance of holding it with this ship than you do with the Ares that I just showed in the previous slide, because at least when you dive in and get scram, you can hold on for a bit. And that's another place where that buffer comes in, because when you're in scram range, you're not going to be outrunning the drones. You're just going to have to sort of take the damage for a little bit. Obviously, you can see the ship is still relatively fast. It's slightly slower than the Ares, but I've never found 4,800 meters a second to be a problem as far as being able to catch things. Other than that, this particular fit, the metaphor damage control, it's necessary. Obviously, you can see for the sake of the CPU, but it is actually a fairly expensive module. I believe that's like 9 million ISK.
Yeah, you could pretty comfortably go to a Meta 3 though.
Yeah, it wouldn't stop you. But even that case, you're still talking like 5 right now. They're still expensive. I mean, relative to the price of the ship, the hull's like 18 or something. But still, it makes certain things possible that wouldn't necessarily be otherwise. So yeah, the other thing that's a real big advantage with that is that you, with the Scrambler, can shut down the MJDs on ships. So when you find a battleship out in some sight while you're ahead of your fleet, pointing them doesn't mean that they just activate the MJD and warp away, jump away, and then warp away generally. So I'm going to go back up to the Malediction. The Malediction, in this case, I would probably change the ballistic control system out for damage control. I've got meta missiles on there. You could probably fit T2 if you change to a meta damage control. There's some options. I actually have to probably relink the fit, because this is still showing it with ship bonuses for light missiles, but it doesn't actually make a difference for the fit. It's just because the thing is, even though you're not bonused for missiles, for light missiles out of a Malediction anymore, they're still a really good option, because they blap drones off relatively quickly, even with poor DPS, and they are you don't have to wait for those drones to catch up to you where they're in range to start doing damage. Maledictions are still ridiculously fast. Obviously, 5,028, very similar numbers to the Ares as far as that goes. But just a solid ship. A lot of people complain that, oh, you're foregoing a ship bonus because it gets armor resistance bonus. That's true. It can be armor tanked. It's very effective in a dual prop configuration with ancillary armor reps. It's really more, in my opinion, that sort of fit works good for small gang, works good for solo, even tandem work. But when you're tackling for a fleet, when you're forward scouting for a fleet, there's only a few things that truly matter for your ship. And those things are not DPS output. They are not ability to necessarily like actively tank incoming damage, although it can help. The numbers that matter are how fast can you warp, how fast can you get into warp to chase things down, and how fast does the ship move. And then, like I said, can you weather a little bit of incoming damage to wait until your fleet actually arrives. So the last one's Crow. This has been recently nerfed pretty heavily, I would say. I don't even think there's a way to describe it without saying it was nerfed. I mean, the ship used to be able to move faster. It used to be able to hit harder. It used to be able to tank more if you wanted it to. This is a configuration that is, reasonable. You'll notice in this case, you lose a lot of speed versus the other ones, even with a couple modules to try and bring some of that speed back. You could go with like an ancillary or auxiliary thrusters as far as a rig. The small polycarbon gives you a little bit more agility. It's just not that fast of an interceptor at this point. With light missiles, it's still, it does okay volley damage, but you don't have enough room to fit 4 T2 launchers. you really don't have a lot of options because of the lack of low slots in the ship. Um, you still do get the advantage of a warp scrambler because of the 4 mid slots that it gets, which obviously gives you the same options that you had with the stiletto, except that it's not as fast. In this case, it's not as tanky, um, and the DPS output. Who cares? That's not the point of the ship. So I think previously the Crow was in a really strong position. It was probably one of the best, um, especially when you went out in a group of like just Crows, which is part of why they got nerfed. You could, get enough of them together where you could volley a lot of things off the field, other frigates and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I hate to just like bash on the thing because I think it's still a fun ship to fly, but it's just not up to par with the other ones in this configuration. Maybe somebody out there's got something put together that's like really good and I'm not aware of it or whatever, but um, I don't know. Makir, have you rebuilt anything? Kamina, you?
No, mostly I've just been flying the slicers and that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So
That's a different class. But
it's a
yeah.
different type of critter.
Mm-hmm. But the Crow took a really, really hard nerf in the most recent changes that took place to it, and I don't know. I'm sure there's some way to reconfigure it to be viable, but previously you were able to get numbers that were like near equivalent to a Garmer out of Crow with some links and some implants, and it was like way, way out of line compared to the rest of them. But it was always kind of slow. Now it's like really slow because you don't even have options for low slots to make it faster. Anyway, let's keep moving. Any thoughts on any of the fits we just talked about? I'm reading the stream too. If anybody wants to type questions, I don't have any delay on it, so I should be able to answer stuff that comes up. Well, okay. So obviously, when you look at this, you'll see that the picture of the overview that I have on here is maybe a little older, but the point remains the same. Keep your overview stuff as simple as possible. That is probably the best way to describe it. The more information that is coming in, the more you have to sort in your brain and figure out what's happening. And when it comes to flying interceptors, you don't have that much time to necessarily figure every little thing out because everything on the screen, as far as the velocity and the distances, they're going to be changing constantly. Because obviously you're going to be moving constantly. So for me personally, people have different preferences when it comes to their overviews. But for me personally, I remove almost everything from the overview that is not a player's ship. So I don't have any NPC ships. I leave the gates because I like to be able to fucking see them when I'm traveling from place to place. It's not really for combat stuff, but it's nice to have them on there. I keep the sun on mine because I find it kind of a pain to click on it in space. And I don't have it shown here, but put drones on their own tab. That way when you need to, you can swap to the drone tab, see which ones are closing on you because you've got them sorted by distance. Similarly, when you're flying in your normal overview, you want to organize things by distance as well, from near to far, because whatever's closest happens to be a priority for you to know about. The other thing that's important and doesn't always happen is you'll want to remove friendlies from your overview. A lot of times I'll see videos of people flying I'll see a lot of people flying and the videos of whatever that they'll post where you can see all of the friendly purples on their list. That's all information that you, as an interceptor pilot, don't necessarily need to have. You'll want the brackets shown when you can. Obviously, in those really big fights, it can be kind of a pain. But anyway, the other thing is add velocity to the overview. You will obviously know how fast you're capable of going, but you can't necessarily just intuit how fast something else is traveling in the game. It's not easy to figure that out just by looking at the brackets moving towards each other in space. So as a way to figure out whether something's able to overtake you or not, that information combined with the distance information will let you determine whether something's closing faster than you can escape or not, which is important information. A lot of people prefer the radial velocity on there as well. I don't. I figure that's just more numbers I need to sort through because truly you could figure out if you needed to the radial velocity by figuring out, or really you could estimate the radial velocity by figuring out the distance change versus their velocity, but it's all, you're estimating things like that. You're not going to know the exact numbers.
Yeah. Do you add the transversal numbers on there at all, or no? I'm just thinking about times when you got to go run into something like a tornado or something like that. And you don't really care about its velocity, but you do care about a little bit of transversal.
Well, you want to have plenty of transversal, but you're going to do it manually, right? So you're not going to necessarily rely on the transversal number that shows up. You'll feel it out, and we're going to go over that very shortly, actually. So it's a good segue. This is my very crude diagram about how to get onto a target. In the diagram here, you can see I've got a red dotted line. That is sort of where you will get killed. That's traveling directly at the target. Don't do what the red dotted line is. And really what that represents is if you don't pilot manually and you just click on the target, right click, orbit, whatever your desired range is, your ship will fly directly at the target until it gets to that range, and it will take a 90-degree turn in a random direction and start the orbit on that target. But unfortunately, or really fortunately for the game, but unfortunately for the people who do that, they will end up dead a lot of the time because traveling directly at a target provides you with no transversal in order to escape being hit by their guns. So the green line that I have there, that sort of represents the route you want to take. Obviously, this is a 2D picture. It's a 3D game, but the dotted arrow is actually maybe a bit more important. So that dotted arrow, let's just a hypothetical. Let's say you just jumped through a gate, and a NATO is a perfect example because they're really easy to tackle, and you would obviously definitely go for it in an interceptor. You jump through a gate. You see this guy sitting at maybe 100 kilometers. So you have your gate cloak. So you have a second to figure out where things are in space. A lot of times there is a bunch of celestials spread out on the horizon behind your target. My advice for how to figure out whether you can engage a target is to pick one of the celestials that are to some degrees away from the actual target and burn towards it. So by doing that, you are creating transversal velocity against the target, but at the same time, you are providing yourself with an instant warp out, so that let's say you find out this guy somehow managed to fit his tornado to track you really well at 100 kilometers with whatever guns he happens to be using, and you need to go. You're not going, oh, where do I need to warp to? You've already got your align point. You get hit one time really hard, and you go, I gotta leave, warp. And obviously you're not going to be pointed because this guy's way off the gate, whatever. But in all likelihood versus a tornado, tornadoes can't track very well. Even when they're set up to, they don't do great against frigates. That's just the way that they're designed. That's the way all those attack battle cruisers are designed. So if the tornado pilot's not good, what you'll be able to do then is you take that align point and you maybe pick a different align point that puts you in a shallower angle towards the target. Eventually, when you've determined that you can essentially just approach them without being able to be hit, you obviously maintain some transversal velocity, but you bring that angle in slowly and then get that orbit. And with the fleet interceptors, generally you start with the warp disruptor. If you have both, you consider going for a scram if the target's moving relatively quickly and you need to slow it down for your incoming fleet, because that is the point, that you have a fleet coming. But anyway, things you'll want to do when you initially do this, you want to determine what's being shot at you. If there's a big difference between medium autocannons sneakily loaded onto a tornado and it sitting the same distance away, but with 1400 millimeter artillery cannons. You need to pay attention to what those notifications are as you're being shot at by them. And it obviously just says it right in the middle of the screen. So just read and then figure out the difference between them. So know ahead of time what types of things are dangerous to you and what types of things are not. Know your point range. Obviously, that's significant. Based on skills, it can vary quite a bit in the interceptors. Even with bad skills, I believe level 1 still puts you to 26 kilometers or so. But level 5, which is not that hard of a train, really, it's like 10 days or something. And it's totally worth doing if you're going to be flying interceptors at any, for any amount. Is 30 kilometers with a Tech 2 with no bonuses, like with no links rather. And then links, it's like 40 something. But so you'll know that, and then you'll have your optimal orbiting range based on that. Most of the time, the way you'll want to determine whether you need to pilot manually or you can just use the automated orbit function. Now, a lot of people never use that. It'll always get you killed. But sometimes there's a lot of benefit in being able to just set an orbit once you have the target pinned. Certain things are not dangerous to you even in that sort of setup. Like recently I had a Legion that I tackled in some site, right? Well, he was ham fit, so he was never going to do any damage to me. He was afterburner fit, so he was never going to catch up to me. He was never going to juke the ship. There was no real chance I'm moving more than 5 times his maximum speed. As a rule of thumb, what I generally tell people is if the target that you're attempting to tackle can move greater than 50% of your orbiting speed, not your maximum speed, but the speed that you are maintaining well at your optimal orbiting distance, which is generally a few hundred meters a second slower, then you don't want to use the automated orbit function. Other times, for manual piloting, if there's ever multiple targets on grid, you can't rely on the automated orbit to keep you out of the range of the enemy that you're not orbiting. So other cases, obviously, if you're taking a lot of incoming damage, if you need to leave, that's all manual piloting. A lot of new people kind of do this thing where, oh no, I'm starting to take a lot of damage, I need to warp, and they just right-click in space and select whatever their favorite celestial happens to be at that very moment, and then they hit the warp button. It stops their ship dead, generally, because they don't happen to be aligned to the thing that they've selected, and they get killed in that last moment, or even if they don't get killed right in that last moment, they get tackled in that last moment where they've stopped all of their forward momentum. So that's another great reason to have a little bit of a buffer, because you start taking a lot of damage, you can go, okay, I need to extract from this situation. I select a celestial that's in line with the direction I happen to already be traveling. that doesn't necessarily cross paths for me or any of the other enemy ships, and then I use that as my warp out. Generally, you overheat when this is happening because you've got maybe, I don't know, 5 to 10 seconds before it's all over anyway. But don't ever just spam the warp button. That's kind of the point.
Sounds good. I won't. From now on.
Don't do it, here. Don't do it. So, on the next page, I just have some key terms that people use while they're scouting or while they're FCing. And, you know, it's sort of taken for granted that people all have the vernacular of the game down. But a lot of new people don't. And so, tackled, that's an important one. That's a pretty obvious one. But aggressed, also fairly obvious. Red boxed, so a lot of these mean the same thing, but they're, you know, significantly different when they're likely to be said. Like most people don't say red boxed unless they're on a gate. It's kind of a weird distinction, right? But like, you know, maybe they'll say red boxed if they're tackling somebody in the site and they get aggressed by the target. But most of the time, that comes up when they're on the opposite side of a gate trying to bait some guy into shooting them. That's just the way that people talk. Obviously, yellow boxed, just being like targeted by somebody, not being aggressed. Pounce. Do you guys? I don't know. People can read on the stream. Do you see any of the? Do you see any terms in there that you don't recognize? I mean, a lot of them. I'm sure there's tons of terms that people all say, and you can kind of just derive the meaning from the context. But it's still, I figured, something that's important to get out of the way. It's really horrible when you end up with a scout that hasn't done it before, and they go, "What do you mean W up?" Or "What's a pounce?" And you go, "Oh shit, we're never gonna kill anything." Everybody's very quiet. The terms, like I said, they're fairly obvious. Feel free to go over it on your own time. It's cool. So, in order to keep this in a relatively reasonable amount of time, there is a lot of information out there that exists related to descanning, related to finding targets when you're out in space. When you're scouting for a fleet, knowing how to descan is important. But I'm not going to teach you how to descan in this particular thing, because it really is something you just have to go do a couple times and then you'll have it. I'm going to go back for
well, the basics of it anyways.
So W up generally in fleets when the scout has tackle on a target, that scout will place a bunch of like a string of W's in fleet, and then that will allow people to just right click on the name and warp to them. That's all that means. But anyways, there is some stuff though that is important for scout interceptors to do, regardless of whether they are finding targets on the other side of the gate for the fleet or not. The general like protocol for it, if you want to call it that, is to jump in, tell the FC how many people are in local. Usually you'll want to say which people if it's a group that is recognizable. You'll want to do a 360 D-scan of the whole area for any ships that are on D-scan, and obviously notify the FC. And then actually there's some D-scan tools if there's a lot, which are basically you can copy the D-scan information from in-game, paste it into the browser-based tool, and it'll spit out a whole bunch of a list of the types of ships that are on scan, the number of ships that are on scan, and it's very helpful. It's a lot more helpful than some guy being like, there's tornado, bomber, interceptor, whatever. And then obviously the most obvious information is going to come out first when you jump through. If there's stuff on grid, you're going to say what's on grid, and you're going to tell them what range things are at on grid, and then you're going to tell the FC about any bubbles that exist. Just because your interceptor is immune to bubbles does not mean that your fleet is likely immune to bubbles, and it's important because bubbles can end up meaning that there's bombers around. It can mean that your fleet is going to be trapped. And it's just, and a good FC will be able to mitigate the risks related to having to deal with bubbles, but not if they don't know that they're there. So that is a key thing for every scout, every interceptor pilot. Tell FCs about bubbles, especially if they're not anchored bubbles. I mean, every bubble you should tell them about, but just like one that a saber dropped and jumped through a gate, you'll want to know that too. Then the other thing to do, a lot of new scouts don't know, is that as you change positions in the system that you're in, your D-scan has a maximum range. It's like just over 14 AUs. And as you move through the system, hit the D-scan a few times to see what else is there. Because obviously most systems are slightly larger than 14 AUs. As you move through it, then you'll get more of a picture of everything that's in the system. Did you have any questions about that part? I put a couple links in there for the eVuni D-scanner thing. That's actually pretty good. And then the Intel D-scan.
The only thing I'd add is that there's also that bit of game tool, the Pirate Shuttle Helper thing, which does a little bit of trigonometry.
Yeah, I
to
feel
go
like
figure out where things
I feel like
are.
we need to have a man versus machine contest because I feel like even though that does a good job, that it requires you to go to two places and provide two different D-scan things, right? And I feel like I could just find the target and intuit like where they're likely to be faster than the person could go from point A to point B, copy paste, and then figure out like the likely location that they're at. You know what I'm saying?
Fair enough.
Well, because that thing will be very exact, right? But I'll jump in and I'll be like, well, it's very unlikely that there's a mining barge in the combat site at this location, but that happens to also be in line with an asteroid belt, so I'm going to go to the asteroid belt. I don't have to go to two places to figure that out, but the D-scan tool that you're talking about requires it in order to make an attempt to tell you where the target is. It's a good tool, you're absolutely right, and I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily as comfortable with it, I just would say you wouldn't want that to turn into like a crutch, because even though it's useful and it's fairly fast, there are faster ways to do it in some cases. But then again, if they're off D-scan from you to start with, or if they're in a big cluster or whatever, you're going to have to get multiple warps anyway, and the tool is pretty accurate. You've used it a lot, huh? McCure.
Well, that does a job.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. Okay, so this frame I'd like to talk about. It's a little hard to conceptualize in a 2D picture. Obviously, I've got my little green versus red. The diamonds are representing ships. The little bluish structure is meant to represent a gate. A lot of times, the best fights that take place in this sort of configuration, where one fleet is slightly out of range of another fleet, but there's shots being fired back and forth across this neutral space. Generally, these fights are moving across a few kilometers, maybe a lot of kilometers, as they're taking place. But what happens is that the fastest ships have the opportunity to take advantage of the neutral space that exists most of all. And more than a lot of the higher DPS ships that are just shooting from the back. And so obviously that would be interceptors. And in order to operate with any success inside of that neutral space, you have to understand what types of things are worth you diving in to go after. Things that are like understanding how the enemy fleet, what ships are out of position relative to their friends, and understanding what will be able to destroy you really rapidly. So understanding where the dangerous ships are on grid versus where you are. There's certain long-range anti-support ships that you're not going to do a lot about, like cormorants. Anytime, if the cormorant is set up properly, anytime you're within 100 kilometers of cormorant, unless your fleet can do something about it, it's a problem for all of the small ships that are on grid, because they're going to be taking about 150 consistent DPS from that range through the duration of the fight. If you can go to 130 kilometers, they can't do any damage. But knowing what those types of ships are and understanding the capabilities of the enemy ships, I mean, that's a lot of like overall knowledge of the game before you can be super comfortable with it. But you'll figure it out over time. And enemy hard tackling ships, things that are likely to have scrams, webs, anything that's got bonused webs like a rapier or a shimu or a daredevil, like anything that's going to pin you down is obviously extremely dangerous. Anything that can deal good damage to small targets is a problem, or at least something that you need to be cognizant of. Interceptors in general can ignore things like battleships for the most part. I mean, there's exceptions. Things that have newts are problematic to small ships. Even if they're large newts, one large newt wrecks your entire capacitor, but you start to recharge pretty quickly, and they've got a 24-second cycle time, so you'll likely recharge fast enough to be back in the game. But point being, knowing the capabilities of the enemy ships so that you can determine where you want to be within that neutral space, and then finding the things that are vulnerable to you and your fleet comes with practice. Conceptualizing where that space is, you'll see it happen in nearly every fight, whether it's as straightforward as the photo or not. Photo meaning goofy little drawing. But anyway, the other thing that's really important about a good interceptor pilot for a fleet is they don't necessarily wait for FCs to tell you to do every little thing. You have to be autonomous and able to make decisions about where you want to be on the field, where you want to be in relative to the fleet. You're not going to have time to say, hey, FC, I have an opportunity to go after a ship that's out of position here on grid. What do you want me to do? You really want to be giving them like, hey, I have tackle on this thing. Do you have the ability to do DPS in it? And if the answer is no, you're luckily with an interceptor you can try and break away. But it all comes with sort of practice and understanding of the overall capabilities of every ship in the game. So it's funny when people are like, oh, you can't fly anything else. Well, why don't you just fly an interceptor? Well, that's all well and good, but that, if you want them to do a good job, that may be one of the harder positions for a person to play. But it's fun. It's really fun. So I'll kind of spare you this list. These are probably some different things I think are important to look out for when it comes to flying an interceptor, especially in that sort of space that I was just talking about. And immunity, meaning you can essentially ignore in an interceptor as long as you're doing it right. Bombs and bombers, as long as you're doing it right, they're not going to hurt you that bad, especially if you got a little bit of a buffer. Like torpedoes really don't do anything to you. There's always if you're tackled really badly, you're going to be in trouble, whatever. But if you're tackled and you're not moving, then really all this doesn't apply anyway. So yeah, the guys that are in the fleet with me, we were going to go practice. I'm going to take a sec here to just take any questions through the stream, any questions from you guys in chat with me, and then we'll close it up. And
yeah, the only thing I'll mention is that occasionally, like this happened the other day in the fleet that we had. I had the battleship with the linked navigation computers, and the medium drones were absolutely devastating. This little stiletto, had it stayed on grid for another second longer, it would have died. It's, moving at 7K and
you're
pretty hilarious.
Designed to hit frigates. with medium
Yeah,
drones.
they did a good job of chasing the stiletto off. It came in for tackle, but it couldn't stay with the medium drones with the nav comps on them.
Right. I mean, that's very true. You have to worry about the fact that like drones can be modified now more than they could before. You can rig ships to have increased drone speed. There are ships that have drone speed bonuses. So knowing knowing the variety of things that are likely to have that. I mean, like for instance, right? Uh, you're not likely to see a ship that isn't bonused for drones using drone nav comps or rigging to increase their drone speeds. It could be done, but it's unlikely. So you'll know what ships are likely to be, dedicated drone boats, and you'll have to pay attention to what is happening. Most of the time, you can see a team of hammerheads deployed and go, "Ha! You're doing it wrong. You're never going to hit me ever with a team of hammerheads." But once in a while, if that ship is designed to utilize those, it probably wouldn't be hammerheads. It'd be something like Valkyries. But whatever. Point being, um, you will see it coming. You'll pay attention to it, and you'll watch it happen. So yeah, it doesn't look like anybody wants to ask any questions in the stream. Like I said, I'm going to give it a minute or two longer, and then we will go out and fly around. All right. Well, thanks for watching, everybody, and you guys have a nice evening. We're gonna go fly some interceptors.
Woo!
Thanks for the presentation.
I learned so much. I'm smarter.